The hook. Kang Min-jae walked through the marble lobby of the Imperial Crown Hotel like a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved the ground beneath his feet. He had his hand on another woman's back, not at his side, on her back. Fingers spread wide, proprietary, the way a man touches something he owns. Nyla saw it from the private lounge on the mezzanine level. She was sitting with a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. The condensation had already pooled around the base of the glass, leaving a ring on the white linen. She watched her husband guide that woman past the front desk, past the concierge who nodded without making eye contact, past the elevator bank. And she felt something in her chest go completely, utterly quiet. Not broken, not shattered, quiet. If you've ever watched someone you trusted walk away from you without knowing you were watching, you already understand what happened inside Nyla Brooks in that moment. If this story already has you feeling something, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single episode, because the stories we tell here go places most people don't dare to look. Hit the like button and drop a comment with your city and country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what Nyla did next took 14 months, cost her nothing she hadn't already decided to lose, and left one of Korea's most feared men standing alone in an empire that no longer had a foundation. The hotel lounge had a particular quality of silence that Nyla had always noticed, the kind that expensive rooms manufacture deliberately, the kind that swallows sound and leaves only the sensation of your own heartbeat. She sat with both hands in her lap after setting down the champagne glass. Her back was straight. Her face gave away exactly nothing. A server passed with a tray and glanced at her untouched drink, then looked away quickly. People who worked in that hotel learned fast not to linger near Nyla Brooks Kang. Not because she was unkind, because she had a quality of stillness that made people feel they were interrupting something important, even when she appeared to be doing nothing at all. She had been doing nothing for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She had counted. The woman Min-jae walked in with was younger, though not dramatically so. Late 20s, probably. Korean, immaculately dressed in a way that suggested money that didn't have to announce itself. She'd had her hand through Min-jae's arm, and her head angled slightly toward his shoulder without quite touching it, an intimacy that had its own practiced quality, the kind that develops over time, not over a single evening. That was the part that registered first, not the betrayal itself, the timeline it implied. Nyla picked up her clutch, settled the strap over her wrist, and stood slowly. She left 200,000 won on the table beside the full champagne glass, more than enough, force of habit, and walked to the elevator without looking back toward the lobby. She pressed the button for the 41st floor. In the mirrored elevator wall, she looked at her own face. 41 years old, no makeup smudged, no visible tremor in her jaw or around her eyes. She looked like a woman running a quiet internal calculation, which was, in fact, exactly what she was doing. By the time the doors opened, she had already moved on to the second set of numbers. 7 years is a long time to build something with a person who later pretends the building never happened. Nyla had met Min-jae at an international investment summit in Singapore. She'd been 34, already running a boutique risk intelligence consultancy that had quietly developed a reputation among hedge funds and sovereign wealth managers across Southeast Asia. She wasn't the kind of analyst who appeared on television panels or spoke at TED conferences. She was the kind that powerful people called at 11 in the evening when they needed to understand something the public filings weren't telling them. Min-jae had approached her after a panel session on cross-border capital flow vulnerabilities. He was 37, handsome in the particular way of men who've grown up knowing they'll eventually be in charge of something, comfortable in his own posture, unhurried in his speech. He'd asked her 2 questions about her methodology, and the questions were good enough that she stayed for a third drink she hadn't planned on finishing. She didn't know, that first evening, what the Hanul Syndicate was. She learned incrementally, the way you learn most things that rewrite your understanding of a situation, slowly, then all at once. Min-jae's family had been building the syndicate for 2 generations. His father had operated it the old way, rough and straightforward and brutal when necessary. Min-jae had a different vision. He wanted it laundered into legitimacy. Not just surface legitimacy, but the real kind, where no one could trace the origin of the capital because it had passed through enough hands and holding companies and regional funds to have genuinely transformed into something else. He'd been doing that for 6 years before he met Nyla. She understood what he was doing before he finished explaining it. She told him it was working, but not as efficiently as he believed. She told him specifically which 3 of his shell structures had vulnerabilities that a competent forensic accountant could unravel inside 48 hours. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was just being accurate. He looked at her across the table for a moment without speaking. Then he asked if she was available for dinner the following evening. They were married 11 months later. The first 2 years were the version of the marriage that Nyla returned to sometimes, late at night, when she was being honest with herself about how things had gone wrong. Not the bad years, the early years, the ones where the foundation was being laid, and both of them believed in what they were constructing together. Min-jae had introduced her to his world without hesitation, which had surprised her. She'd expected compartmentalization, the criminal husband who kept his wife separate from his business, the way men like him typically manage their domestic and professional lives. Instead, he brought her into boardrooms. He put her beside him at dinners with people whose names she recognized from financial intelligence briefings she'd written years before she ever met him. "My wife sees things that my entire analysis team misses," he told a room of 12 executives during a dinner at their home in Seongbuk-dong during their first year. He said it with something in his voice that sounded at the time like genuine pride. She built on that. She built deliberately and steadily because that was the only way she knew how to build anything. She began developing a predictive algorithm, not for Min-jae's operations directly, but adjacent to them, processing the same kinds of financial signals, testing the same correlations between corporate distress patterns and criminal capital flow that she'd been theorizing about for years before Singapore. The algorithm worked better than she'd projected. She kept that to herself. In the 3rd year, something shifted in Min-jae. She couldn't have named the moment precisely. It wasn't a single incident, but an accumulation of small ones. A comment at a dinner party delivered lightly that landed wrong. The way he began rephrasing her observations in meetings as though they'd originated with him. A pattern of diminishment so subtle and so consistent that she spent months questioning whether she was reading it correctly. "Nyla thinks like a professor," he said at a golf weekend with 3 other corporate chairmen. He said it while she was standing 2 feet away. Everyone laughed. She smiled. The smile was automatic. She'd had it since childhood. The smile that smoothed things over, that told the room she wasn't bothered, that gave nothing away. She'd grown up in Atlanta as the daughter of a hospital administrator mother and an accountant father who both understood that a black woman in any professional space needed to manage other people's discomfort with her competence before she could get to the actual work. She'd gotten efficient at it. She kept getting more efficient. The private office came together over 14 months, beginning in the 4th year of their marriage. It occupied 3 rooms inside a commercial building in Mapogu, a building Min-jae owned as part of a property holding company, which Nyla had quietly concluded was the single safest location available, since no one who worked for the syndicate would think to surveil a space they believed their boss had full visibility into. She filed the lease under the name of a limited liability company she'd registered in Singapore during a trip she'd taken to visit an old colleague from her pre-Seoul career. The company had no visible connection to her. The connection that existed, a single signatory clause buried in a subsidiary agreement, was technically discoverable but practically invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. She knew exactly where to look because she'd designed the structure herself. Inside those 3 rooms, she built something that didn't have a name for the first 2 years. It was just a system, a proprietary intelligence architecture that processed public corporate data, regulatory filings, cross-border transaction patterns, and market movement signals through a predictive layer. She'd spent a decade refining in her head before she ever had the infrastructure to run it properly. The algorithm was called Siri, internally. She named it after her mother's middle name, Seraphine, because her mother had always been the one in the room who saw trouble coming before it arrived and never once got credit for the warning. Siri began attracting clients through a referral network so discreet that 3 of her first major contracts were signed before either party fully understood what they were signing into. A mid-sized Japanese pharmaceutical company needed risk modeling for an acquisition that was attracting regulatory scrutiny. A Singapore sovereign fund wanted shell company detection run on a portfolio of infrastructure investments in Southeast Asia. A European family office needed someone to tell them why their Korean holdings kept underperforming projections by a specific margin that no one on their team could explain. She told them why. She was right each time. Word of that kind of accuracy traveled in a particular direction, upward and quietly. During that same period, Min-jae began staying out with increasing frequency. He always had explanations. The explanations were always plausible. She'd built enough forensic intelligence models to understand that a plausible explanation is not the same as an accurate one, but she had stopped expecting accuracy from him in the same way she'd once stopped expecting to speak at his dinners. She was focused. She let him believe she was simply adjusting. Wives of powerful men adjusted. That was part of what made them useful to powerful men. The capacity to absorb, accommodate, and continue functioning. Nyla absorbed, accommodated, continued, and kept transferring assets. Every patent she filed through the Singapore company. Every international partnership agreement, every licensing deal, every government consulting contract, structured cleanly, legally, outside any entity that had even a tangential connection to the Haneul Syndicate. By the end of year 5 of their marriage, Siri's technology had been licensed to 11 firms across 4 continents. By year 6, 2 government intelligence agencies had quietly retained her for risk modeling work. By the time Min-jae walked through the Imperial Crown Hotel lobby with his hand on another woman's back, a multinational consortium had been in acquisition discussions with her for 9 months. The acquisition offer sat at $940 million. She hadn't told him about it. She got back to their apartment in Hanam-dong at 10:47. She knew because she looked at the clock when she came through the door. A habit, precise, unglamorous. She changed out of the black dress she'd worn to the dinner she'd attended alone, a charity function for a children's hospital foundation, to which Min-jae had RSVP'd and then canceled at 4 in the afternoon, citing a meeting that had run long. She made herself a cup of barley tea and sat at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She pulled out her phone and sent a single message to her attorney in Singapore, a woman named Priya who'd been building Nyla's legal architecture for 3 years and had never once asked a personal question, which was exactly why Nyla had chosen her. The message said, "Move to phase 4." Then she set the phone face down on the table and finished her tea. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul glittered and moved. The Han River caught the city lights the way it always did at night. Indifferent, huge, continuing. Nyla sat with both hands around the warm cup and thought about her mother. Her mother had worked 2 decades as a hospital administrator in Atlanta, had raised Nyla mostly alone after her father's heart attack when Nyla was 11, and had spent the last 5 years fighting a kidney condition that had cost her more than the family's insurance covered. Nyla had been paying the gap for 3 years without telling anyone. Not because it needed to be a secret, but because it was private. Her money, her mother, her choice. She thought about the phone call 3 months earlier, when her mother had said, "Baby, I don't know how you keep everything together like you do." And Nyla had said, "I just take it one piece at a time, Mama," which was true. She sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight. Min-jae didn't come home. When she finally stood, she washed the cup, dried it, and set it in the cabinet with the others. Then she went to her study, opened her laptop, and spent the next 2 hours reviewing the final structural documents of the acquisition agreement. Every clause was precisely where she'd put it. Nothing was out of place. She saved the document, closed the laptop, and went to bed. She slept for 6 hours. Not easily, but completely. When she woke at 5:30 the next morning, she lay in the gray pre-dawn light with her eyes open for exactly 4 minutes before she got up, made coffee, and began preparing breakfast. Min-jae came home at 8. He said he'd fallen asleep at the office. "Long night," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the careful ease of a man constructing normalcy in real time. "It happens," she said. She set a bowl of juke in front of him, rice porridge, plain, the way he'd liked it since before she met him. She poured his coffee. She sat across from him with her own cup and her phone and a printout of a financial quarterly she'd been reviewing. He ate. She read. They were, to all visible appearances, a couple in a calm marriage navigating a weekday morning. And in a sense, they were, because the performance had never been Nyla's alone. Min-jae had his own version of it, and he was delivering it comfortably, and she let him, because she had 14 months of work to protect. And not a single piece of it required him to know a thing. Min-jae left the apartment at 9:15 without finishing his coffee. Nyla heard the elevator doors close from the kitchen, where she was rinsing the breakfast bowls. She stood at the sink for a moment with the water still running, her hands under the faucet, feeling the temperature shift from warm to cold as she held them there too long. Then she turned the tap off, dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and went back to the table where her printout was waiting. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She did not think about the coffee cup he'd left behind, still half full, still warm. She thought about the acquisition timeline instead, specifically about a clause in the secondary licensing agreement that Priya had flagged 2 weeks earlier as potentially ambiguous under Korean commercial law. Nyla had reviewed it 4 times already. She was going to review it a 5th time, because ambiguity in a $940 million deal was not something she was willing to leave to probability. She worked for 3 hours straight without looking up. The first person to notice something had changed inside Nyla wasn't Min-jae. It was Ha-eun. Ha-eun-jung was Min-jae's personal assistant and had been for 9 years, 3 years longer than the marriage. She was 46, precise, relentlessly organized, and had the particular quality of institutional loyalty that made her indispensable to men like Min-jae while simultaneously making her dangerous to underestimate. She had never been warm toward Nyla, not unfriendly exactly, but careful in the way that people are careful when they've decided their allegiance is already spoken for and they don't want anyone confusing the boundaries. Nyla had always understood Ha-eun perfectly. Ha-eun had always believed she understood Nyla. That was the first miscalculation in a sequence that would eventually prove catastrophic. 3 days after the hotel, Ha-eun called Nyla's personal phone at 2 in the afternoon to confirm a charity luncheon that Nyla had agreed to co-chair the previous month, a high-profile event involving the wives and partners of several syndicate-adjacent corporate leaders, the kind of social occasion that Min-jae had always considered strategically important and expected Nyla to execute without requiring his involvement. The venue confirmed the floral arrangement, Ha-eun said. Her Korean was clipped, formal. And the catering coordinator needs your final approval on the menu by Friday. Cancel it, Nyla said. Silence. 3 full seconds. Cancel. The luncheon. Cancel my co-chair commitment. Send my apologies to the foundation director and tell her a scheduling conflict has come up. Make sure a donation goes out from my personal account as a courtesy. You have the account details. Mrs. Kang, the invitations have already... Ha-eun. Nyla's voice didn't harden. It simply became very clear. Cancel it. Another pause, shorter this time. Of course, Ha-eun said. The call ended. Ha-eun sat at her desk in the Hanul Group's executive suite for a moment after hanging up, holding the phone with both hands. She had worked for Min-jae long enough to understand that when something unexpected happened in his domestic life, it eventually reached his professional life, and it was her job to know which direction the current was moving before it arrived. She called Min-jae's private line. She canceled the luncheon, Ha-eun said when he picked up. A pause. All of it? Her co-chair position, completely. Min-jae said nothing for a moment. Ha-eun could hear the ambient sounds of wherever he was, a room with other people in it, low voices, the particular acoustic quality of the syndicate's private conference room on the 32nd floor. She's probably tired, he said. Ha-eun said nothing. I'll talk to her, he added. Ha-eun said, of course, and let the call end there, because she had learned that sometimes the most useful thing she could do for Min-jae was not say the next thing she was thinking. He talked to her that evening over dinner, or rather he talked, and Nyla listened, which he mistook for the same thing. The foundation director is going to take it personally, he said, serving himself from the pot of doenjang gai she'd made. She still cooked, still kept the apartment running in the same precise rhythms, because the last thing she needed was for Min-jae to become alert to disruption. Chairwoman Lee has been trying to build a relationship with us for 2 years. I know, Nyla said. So why cancel? She looked at him across the table. He had changed out of his suit into a lighter jacket, which meant he'd been home at least an hour before dinner, longer than usual. She registered that without assigning it weight. I've got too much on my plate right now, she said. I'll send a proper apology and make sure the donation covers any inconvenience. It's not about the money. He set his chopsticks down. These relationships take time to build. You know that. I do know that, she said. I've been managing those relationships for 6 years. Something in the directness of it landed slightly wrong, and she watched him register it. a small tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw moved once before he picked up his chopsticks again. "I'm just saying it matters," he said. "Understood," she said. They finished dinner without speaking again. She cleared the table. He went to his study. She washed the dishes with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, and when she was done, she went to her own study, the room he called her reading room, the room she had systematically converted into a secondary operations hub over the previous 8 months, and opened her laptop. Priya had sent a revised version of the secondary licensing agreement at 3 in the afternoon. Nyla pulled it up and began reading from the top, making margin notes in a shorthand that she'd developed herself over 15 years of contract work, a private notation system that would have been indecipherable to anyone else. She worked until midnight. She did not hear Min-jae leave his study. She did not hear him go to bed. When she finally closed the laptop and went to the bedroom, he was already asleep on his side, facing away from the center of the mattress. She stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark, looking at the shape of him under the covers, the rise and fall. Then she went to bed on her side, facing the window, and lay awake for 40 minutes, going over the ambiguous clause one more time in her head until she had it resolved to her satisfaction. The problem with conducting a covert operation inside a marriage is that the marriage itself becomes infrastructure you have to maintain. Nyla had understood this from the beginning and had planned for it accordingly, but planning for something and executing it across months of sustained proximity to the person you're planning against required a kind of sustained emotional discipline that was, she had learned, more exhausting than any of the financial architecture. The financial architecture didn't watch her face when she answered questions. Min-jae did. He wasn't, she had to acknowledge, an unintelligent man. His instincts for people had been sharpened by a career in which misreading someone's intentions could have genuinely lethal consequences. He had survived internal syndicate power struggles, government investigations, and 3 separate attempts by rival organizations to compromise his operations. Not because he was reckless, but because he was observant in the particular way of men who had learned early that the world rewards those who see trouble before it announces itself. The irony of that was not lost on her. 4 weeks after the hotel, he came home early for the second time in a single week. She was in the kitchen when she heard his key in the lock. She was on a call. Her phone was on the counter, speaker on, and the voice on the other end belonged to a senior director at one of the consortium's lead investment banks, who was walking her through a final valuation adjustment. She picked the phone up and switched it off speaker in a single motion, no hesitation, nothing abrupt. Just a smooth adjustment. "So the revised figure accounts for the projected 3-year licensing revenue," the director was saying, "which puts us at 980 if you're willing to accept the extended earn-out structure." "Hold that thought," Nyla said quietly. "I'll call you back in 20 minutes. She ended the call and set the phone face down as Min-jae came into the kitchen, loosening his tie. "Early," she said. "Meeting canceled." He opened the refrigerator, looked inside without apparent purpose. "Who were you on the phone with?" "Priya," she said. It was the name she kept available for exactly these moments. Her Singapore attorney was real, the work they did together was real, and the description was technically accurate in the sense that the call she'd just ended was downstream of work Priya had originated. Something in the contract language for an old client, nothing urgent. He took out a bottle of water and closed the refrigerator. "You've been on the phone a lot lately," he said. Not accusatory. Observational. The tone of a man cataloging things. "End of quarter," she said. "Old clients get anxious." He nodded slowly. Drank from the bottle. Looked at her with the particular quality of attention that she had learned over 7 years to treat as a weather indicator rather than a specific threat. "Are you all right?" he said. The question caught her, not off guard because she'd anticipated it, but in a slightly different form than she'd prepared for. She'd been ready for concern framed as interrogation. This was concern framed as concern, which was worse because it required a different kind of deflection. "I'm tired," she said, which was true. "End of quarter. I'll be better once the current projects close." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded again and went to his study. She stood in the kitchen for another 4 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called the investment bank director back. It was Ha-Yoon who moved first. Nyla hadn't anticipated that. She'd modeled Min-jae's potential responses, his potential behaviors, his likely timeline for suspicion. She hadn't adequately weighted Heian as an independent variable. That was her second mistake in a sequence she would later reconstruct with forensic precision. 6 weeks after the hotel, Nyla arrived at a quarterly review meeting for a Korean-based Women's Enterprise Foundation, one of 3 legitimate board positions she held under her own name. Positions she'd accepted years earlier because they were visible in a way that was strategically useful, connecting her publicly to the Korean business world on terms that had nothing to do with Min-jae's operations. The foundation's director, a woman named Bae Soo-jin, met her at the door with a particular careful expression. "Mrs. Kang," a pause that was approximately 1 beat too long. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Nyla said. They walked to the conference room. 3 other board members were already seated. Nyla took her usual chair at the left side of the table and pulled out her portfolio and her pen. The meeting ran 40 minutes. It was unremarkable until the final 10 minutes, when Bae Soo-jin raised a proposal for a new partnership with a financial literacy initiative that she said had been referred through. She checked her notes. An executive contacts network connected to the Hanyul group. Nyla kept her face entirely neutral. "Who made the referral?" she asked. Bae Soo-jin looked at her notes again. "A Miss Ha-eun-jung. I believe she's—" "I know who she is," Nyla said. "When did she make contact with the foundation?" "About 3 weeks ago. She said the partnership might align with your interests, given your involvement here." Nyla set her pen down very carefully. Ha-eun had reached into one of Nyla's board positions. Not aggressively, not obviously. She'd inserted a connection, a reference point, a thread of visibility. It was, Nyla understood immediately, not a coincidence and not a generous gesture. It was placement. Ha-eun was creating a channel that Min-jae could use to monitor a space that had previously been entirely outside his view. "I'll need to review the proposal before the board takes a position," Nyla said. "Can you send me the documentation?" "Of course." Nyla wrote a single note in the margin of her portfolio page, not the proposal details, just 2 words, in her own shorthand. "Speed up." She called Priya that night from her car, parked in the underground garage of their building, engine off, the concrete walls absorbing the sound. "How long to close the final transfer?" Nyla asked. "The Singapore restructure is done. The remaining issue is the sole registered sub," Priya said. Her voice had the quality of someone who was also sitting in a quiet room thinking carefully. "The documentation for the directorship transfer is ready, but processing runs 4 to 6 weeks minimum through the commercial registry." "Can we get it to 3? A pause. "With an expedited filing and the right submission sequence, possibly. It increases the paper trail slightly." "That's acceptable," Nyla said. "File it." "Nyla." Priya's voice shifted fractionally. "Is something moving on his end?" "Not yet," Nyla said, "but someone on his team is paying attention." "How much time do you think you have?" Nyla looked through the windshield at the concrete pillar directly in front of the car. There was a crack running from the base of it to about halfway up, thin, old, probably irrelevant. "Enough," she said. "File everything." Min-jae found the discrepancy on a Tuesday. It wasn't Sierra. It wasn't the acquisition. It was something smaller, a licensing fee payment that had been routed through a Singapore entity that his financial compliance team had flagged during a routine internal review. The payment itself was legal, clean, appropriately documented. What caught his compliance director's attention was the routing. The Singapore company's registration number appeared in 2 separate databases under slightly different subsidiary structures, which was the kind of inconsistency that most reviews would have missed, but which Hanyul Group's internal audit team, refined over years of navigating regulatory scrutiny, was specifically trained to catch. The compliance director brought it to Ha-eun first. Ha-eun brought it to Min-jae. Min-jae sat in his office on the 32nd floor and looked at the document for a long time. The Singapore entity was real. The licensing agreement was real. Nothing in the document was false. But he didn't recognize the name at the top of the company structure. He called Ha-eun back in. "Run the full trace on this entity," he said. Ha-eun took the document. She looked at him. "How deep?" she asked. "All the way," he said. The trace took 4 days. Ha-eun used 3 separate research channels. The Hanyul Group's Internal Intelligence Unit, a private forensic accounting firm they retained for sensitive corporate investigations, and a third-party regulatory database service that specialized in cross-jurisdictional entity mapping. On the fourth day, she came back to Min-jae's office and closed the door. She set a folder on his desk. Inside was a printed summary, 11 pages, organized by entity type, with cross-referenced subsidiary structures and signatory records. Min-jae opened it. He read the first 3 pages without his expression changing. Then he reached the page that listed the original director and sole signatory authority. He went very still. Hyun stood on the other side of the desk, hands clasped, watching him. She had known what was in the folder for approximately 20 hours before bringing it to him. She'd spent those hours deciding how to deliver it and had concluded, finally, that there was no version of this delivery that wouldn't be a rupture. How long has this entity been operating? Min-jae's voice was completely level. Based on the registration records, Hyun said carefully, approximately 5.5 years. He turned another page. The client list was redacted. She hadn't been able to penetrate that layer, but the revenue indicators derived from tax filing summaries available through the Singapore regulatory database were not. He looked at those numbers for a while. She built this inside my building, he said. It wasn't a question. Hyun had confirmed which commercial property had been used as the primary operational address. It was a Hanoel Group property in Mapogu, a building Min-jae had visited twice in the past 3 years for unrelated property reviews. Yes, Hyun said. Min-jae closed the folder. He put both hands flat on the desk. His breathing didn't change. The room was completely quiet for a long moment. Get me Lee Sang-wook, he said. Lee Sang-wook was the Hanoel Group's chief legal counsel, the man who handled the situations that couldn't be resolved through normal corporate channels. Tonight? Hyun asked. Right now, Min-jae said. Nyla was in the Mapogu office when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. She was mid-session in a technical review of Siri's latest output model with one of her senior developers, a young woman named Chaelin, who'd been with her for 2 years, and who was, Nyla had concluded, probably the most naturally talented algorithmic thinker she'd encountered in 20 years of working with analysts. She looked at the screen. Min-jae. Give me 5 minutes, she told Chaelin. She stepped into the adjacent room, the small one she used as a personal office, and closed the door. Then she answered. Where are you? Min-jae asked. His voice was the level kind, the kind she'd learned to read like a pressure gauge. The flatter it was, the higher the pressure behind it. Working, she said. Why? Working where? She kept her voice unhurried. A client meeting ran long. I'm in Mapo. What's going on? A pause. 3 seconds. Come home, he said. Min-jae, I'm in the middle of Nyla. His voice dropped 1 register. Not louder, quieter, which was worse. Come home. She stood in the small room with its bare white walls and the filing cabinet in the corner and the single window that looked out onto the rooftop access of the adjacent building. She thought about 14 months. She thought about the acquisition timeline. She thought about the directorship transfer that Priya had filed 6 days ago, which was currently sitting in a processing queue at the Seoul Commercial Registry. She thought about 3 weeks. That was how much time she needed. I'll be home by 8, she said. Another pause. Fine, he said. The call ended. She stood for a moment. Then she went back to the review room and said to Chaelin, very calmly, I need you to begin the data migration to the secondary server. Everything that's currently on the main architecture, start it tonight. Chaelin looked up from her screen. All of it? All of it, Nyla said. And when you're done, you don't come back to this office. You work from the Gangnam hub from tomorrow. Chaelin was 28 years old and had been working in financial intelligence long enough to understand that when the person who signs your checks tells you to disappear without asking why, you disappear without asking why. Okay, she said. Nyla picked up her bag. She left the Mapogu office for the last time at 6:47 in the evening. She didn't look back at the building from the street. She'd built something extraordinary inside it, and she was leaving the shell behind the way you leave a place when you've already taken everything that mattered out of it. Min-jae was in the living room when she got home, not his study. The living room, which meant he'd been waiting without wanting to appear like he was waiting, which meant his internal state was less controlled than his voice on the phone had suggested. He was standing at the window when she came in. He turned. "Sit down," he said. "I just got home," she said. "Let me put my bag down." "Sit down, Nyla." She set her bag on the console table by the entrance and walked to the sofa. She sat. She crossed her legs and put her hands in her lap and looked at him. He came away from the window and stood in the center of the room. He had a folder in his hand. She recognized the format. Hanul Group internal documentation, the kind his team produced for sensitive reviews. He set it on the coffee table and pushed it toward her. She didn't touch it. "What is this?" she said. "You tell me," he said. She looked at the folder without opening it. She'd planned for this moment. Not this specific version of it, not this exact night, but a version. She'd spent time with it in her head. She'd run through the variables. What she hadn't planned for was the way he looked at her right now. Not the anger she'd expected, not the cold, controlled rage she'd seen him deploy with other people. What she saw instead was something rawer than that. Something that might, under different circumstances, have been close to hurt. She opened the folder. She looked at the first page for the appropriate amount of time. Then she looked up at him. "You had me investigated," she said. "I had an entity investigated," he said. "And it turned out the entity was you. That entity is a legally registered company that I built using my own capital and my own intellectual property," she said. "None of it. Inside my building." His voice cracked on the last word. Not broke. Cracked. A hairline fracture in the composure. "You ran a competing intelligence operation inside a building I own, using the cover of our marriage to stay invisible for 5.5 years. It was never competing with your operations," she said. "The work is... Do you understand how this looks?" He pulled his hand back through his hair. "Do you understand what my legal team said when I showed them this? Do you understand what happens to my credibility if it gets out that my own wife... Your credibility." She said it quietly. Just those 2 words, and something in the room shifted. He stopped. She held his gaze. "That's what concerns you," she said. "Your credibility. Not what I built. Not why I built it somewhere you'd never look." She paused. "Not why I needed somewhere you'd never look." The silence that followed was the longest one they'd had in 7 years of marriage. Long enough that the city outside the window seemed to get quieter, though it didn't, because Seoul never got quieter. "What are you saying?" he said. "I'm saying what I've been not saying for 3 years," she said. "And I'm done not saying it." He sat down in the chair across from her. Not deliberately. More like the option of standing became suddenly less available. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him, and he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face since the early years of their marriage. "You knew," he said. "Not about the business, about something else." "About the woman?" She kept her voice completely steady. "Since the hotel, 3 months ago." He went very still. "Before that?" she said. "I suspected for longer than that." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. "But I want you to understand something clearly, Min-jae. What I built, that wasn't because of her. She was just the last door I needed to walk through." He stared at her. She reached into her bag, the bag she'd set down by the entrance, and then picked up again before coming to sit, the detail he hadn't registered, and placed a manila envelope on the coffee table beside his folder. She didn't push it toward him. She just left it there. "What is that?" he said. "You can look at it tonight, or you can look at it tomorrow," she said. "But it doesn't change regardless of when you open it." She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the bedroom and closed the door. Behind her, in the living room, Kang Min-jae sat in the silence with 2 folders on the table in front of him. One that showed him what his wife had built, and one that would show him, when he finally opened it, that she had already decided to leave. And for the first time in a decade of running one of Korea's most feared criminal organizations, he did not know what to do with what was directly in front of him. Min-jae opened the envelope at 11:43 at night. Nyla knew the exact time because she was lying on her side of the bed in the dark, completely still, listening. She heard the sound of the manila envelope tearing. He hadn't used the flap. He'd torn the side, which told her something about the state of his hands. She heard paper sliding. A long silence. Then the particular sound of a man exhaling through his nose slowly, the way people breathe when they're trying to keep something contained that wants very badly to come out. She didn't move. She lay with her eyes open in the dark and let the silence do its work. He didn't come to the bedroom that night. She heard him on the phone at some point after midnight, his voice too low to make out words, coming through the wall from his study with the quality of someone speaking carefully, choosing each word before releasing it. The call lasted approximately 20 minutes, then silence again. Then the sound of his study door and footsteps in the hallway and the guest room door closing. She lay there until 2 in the morning. Then she got up, went to her study, and sent Priya 3 words, confirm registry status. Priya's response came back in 11 minutes, which meant Priya had been awake and waiting. Still processing, estimated 14 to 18 days. Nyla stared at that for a moment. 14 to 18 days. She typed back, "What can we do to reduce that? I'm already working it. I'll have an answer by morning." She closed the laptop and sat in the dark of her study for a while, her hands in her lap, her back straight. The filing cabinet was to her left. The window was ahead of her. Seoul was still doing what Seoul did at 2 in the morning, moving, glowing, indifferent. She thought about what Lee Sang-wook would tell Min-jae when they met, which would be tomorrow at the latest. Lee Sang-wook was not a man who delayed. He would have reviewed the folder Ha-yeon brought him. He would have built a preliminary legal framework overnight, and he would have his first recommendation ready before the morning was out. The recommendation would be to freeze. Not Nyla. Not directly. The Singapore entity. The sole registered subsidiary. Every financial instrument that touched either of those entities. On injunction, standard procedure, when a corporate discovery revealed potentially contested assets inside a marital structure. Lee Sang-wook would couch it in neutral language, frame it as protective rather than aggressive, and Min-jae would understand exactly what it was designed to do. She had 11 days of processing margin before the commercial registry completed the directorship transfer. If Lee Sang-wook moved on an injunction within the next 72 hours, the transfer would be frozen mid-process, and the Singapore entity would be flagged as contested. If the Singapore entity was flagged as contested, the consortium would pause. If the consortium paused, the acquisition window, which had a hard deadline built into the offer structure, would close. She sat with all of that for exactly as long as she needed to sit with it. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she'd saved under a 3-letter code that she'd never had to use before tonight. It rang twice. "It's 3 in the morning," said the man who answered. His name was Daniel Yu, and he was a Seoul-based commercial litigation attorney who had no professional connection to Min-jae, no prior relationship with the Hanewol Group, and had been quietly retained by Nyla 14 months ago specifically for this contingency. "I know," she said. "I need you to file a preemptive protective order on the Seoul subsidiary. Tonight if possible, first thing tomorrow at the absolute latest." A pause. She heard him sit up in bed. "What happened?" he said. "The other side found the entity." "How much do they know?" "Enough to move on an injunction. I need to get ahead of it." "Nyla." His voice was awake now, fully. "If we file first, we're showing our hand. We're acknowledging the dispute before he formally raises one." "I know," she said. "File it anyway." Another pause. "Okay," Daniel said. "I'll need the subsidiary documents and the Singapore registration records. Send them to my secure server." "They're already there," she said. A brief silence. "You prepared this," he said. "I prepared everything," she said. "I just hoped I wouldn't need this part." She was dressed and in the kitchen by 6:30 the next morning. Min-jae came out of the guest room at 7. He was already in his suit, which meant he'd either slept in it or gotten up early enough to dress before she emerged, and neither option suggested a peaceful night. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. She was making coffee. She had 2 cups out. He looked at the 2 cups for a moment. Then he came in and sat at the table. She set a cup in front of him and sat across from him with her own. Neither of them spoke for almost a minute. Outside, the morning had the particular gray quality of a Seoul autumn. Low light, flat sky, the kind of morning that felt like it was withholding something. "Lee Sang-wook is going to tell you to freeze the entities," she said. Min-jae looked at her over his cup. "He's probably already told you," she said. "Last night, on the phone." His expression didn't change. "You heard that." "I heard you were on the phone. I didn't hear what was said." She set her cup down. "I didn't need to." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you already know what's coming." I filed a preemptive protective order on the sole subsidiary this morning, she said. My attorney filed it at 6:15. If Lee Sang-wook moves on an injunction, he'll hit the protective order first. That buys me time. Min-jae stared at her. She watched him process it. The fact that she'd anticipated his legal move and countered it before he'd made it. The fact that she had an attorney on standby who'd filed court documents before 7 in the morning. The fact that the woman sitting across from him drinking coffee had been running a parallel legal strategy inside their marriage, the same way she'd been running a parallel company. Who are you? He said. It came out quieter than she thought he intended. The same person I've always been, she said. You just stopped looking. His jaw tightened. He pushed back from the table and stood. I have to go. I know, she said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He got to the kitchen doorway, then stopped without turning around. The envelope, he said. The divorce papers. Yes. You've been planning this since the hotel. She picked up her coffee cup. I've been planning this since long before the hotel, she said. The hotel was just when I knew I was ready. He left without responding. She sat in the kitchen and finished her coffee. The twist came from a direction she hadn't mapped. That was the thing about running an operation with genuine precision. You modeled every vector you could see, and you reinforced every vulnerability you could identify, and you prepared contingencies for the contingencies. What you couldn't fully account for was the variable that existed outside your visibility because it existed outside the boundaries you'd drawn around your own understanding of the situation. The variable's name was Park Jin-ho. She didn't know that name until the third day after Min-jae found the folder. She was in a coffee shop in Seochogu, not her usual neighborhood, chosen deliberately, meeting with Daniel Yu to review the protective order status. Daniel was a compact man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that gave nothing away in professional settings, which was a quality she valued so highly in people that she'd made it a primary selection criterion when she'd chosen him. He set his phone on the table between them and turned it so she could see the screen. This came through my monitoring service at 4 this morning, he said. She looked at the screen. It was a commercial registry alert, the kind generated automatically when a filing status changed on a tracked entity. The entity was the sole subsidiary. The status change wasn't the injunction she'd been watching for. It was something else, a prior lien. She looked at Daniel. Explain this, she said. There's a pre-existing secured interest registered against the subsidiary, he said, filed 14 months ago, before your protective order, before any of Kang's legal activity. It predates everything. Her hands were flat on the table. She kept them there. That's not possible. I set up the subsidiary. I reviewed every filing. The lien wasn't filed against the subsidiary directly, Daniel said. He took the phone back and pulled up a second document. It was filed against the registered office address through a collateral agreement connected to a commercial lease. The lease was for the Mapogu office space. She went very still. The building is Kang's, Daniel said. The lease agreement for that office space, the one you signed through the Singapore entity, had a standard commercial collateral clause. It's buried in subsection 14 of the standard Hanul Group commercial lease template. Every tenant in that building signed the same clause. It creates a passive secured interest in any operating business conducted from that address in favor of the building's owner. The silence that followed lasted a long time. In favor of the building's owner, she repeated. Kang Min-jae, Daniel said, or more precisely, Hanul Properties KR, which he controls exclusively. She looked at the table surface, the grain of the wood, a small scratch near the edge that someone had left at some point, unrelated to anything. So when I leased the office space, she said slowly, I inadvertently created a secured interest in my own operating company in favor of my husband's holding company. Through a boilerplate clause that no one flags because it's designed to look like standard property collateral language, Daniel said. It's not uncommon in commercial leases. It becomes an issue when the tenant builds a business of significant value from that address. A $940 million business, she said. Yes. She sat back. She felt the chair's weight against her spine. The coffee shop around them continued its morning. The sound of the espresso machine, two women talking at the table behind her, the door opening and closing as people came in from the cold. Can it be challenged? She said. The clause itself is enforceable, Daniel said. Whether the lien translates to an actual ownership interest in the company versus just the physical assets of the leased space, that's where there's room to argue. But it's not a clean argument, Nyla. It gives his legal team a legitimate hook to contest the acquisition. Park Jin-ho, she said, the name she'd seen at the bottom of the lien filing. Who is he? Daniel paused. He's a commercial property attorney. He works exclusively for Hanul Properties. He found the clause. Hyun found the clause and he filed the instrument, Daniel said. The lien was registered 14 months ago, which means they knew about the office space 14 months ago. She said it flatly. The implications arranged themselves in her head with the precision of a structural collapse, each piece falling in sequence, each one taking the next one with it. They knew about the Mapogu office. They knew I was operating from there. They filed the lien and said nothing. She looked at Daniel. They've been waiting, she said. Daniel held her gaze. That's what it looks like. She stood up. She left money on the table. Too much, she didn't count it. And she picked up her bag and walked out of the coffee shop without her coat, which she'd left on the back of the chair. And she was halfway down the block before she stopped and stood on the sidewalk in the cold air and put her hand against the stone face of the building beside her, just for a moment, just to feel something solid. Then she turned around and went back for her coat. She sat in her car in a parking structure for 40 minutes. The car was off. The parking structure was on a quiet street in Seocho-gu, 3 blocks from the coffee shop. She'd parked here before during other meetings. She knew the layout, knew the cameras were positioned at the entry and exit points, and not inside the structure itself, knew that a person sitting in a parked car in here was essentially invisible. She sat with both hands on the steering wheel even though the engine was off, and she wasn't going anywhere. 14 months ago. They had filed the lien 14 months ago. She had begun her exit timeline 14 months ago. The proximity was not coincidental. She understood that now with the cold clarity of someone who had just had the floor of their own architecture give way beneath them. Ha-Yoon had not been responding to the hotel incident. Ha-Yoon had been moving long before that, which meant Ha-Yoon had known or suspected something significant about Nyla's activities before Min-jae had. And Ha-Yoon, loyal, precise, strategically calculating Ha-Yoon, had not told Min-jae what she knew. Instead, she had filed a legal instrument quietly and waited. The question was why. If Ha-Yoon had told Min-jae 14 months ago that Nyla was operating a company from his building, the confrontation would have happened then. The exit timeline would have been destroyed before it began. Nyla would have had nothing in place. Ha-Yoon hadn't done that. She'd filed the lien. She'd said nothing. She'd watched. Nyla sat with that for a long time. Ha-Yoon had her own interest in this. Not just loyalty to Min-jae. Something else. She pulled out her phone and called a number she'd never called before. A private research contact she'd built through her intelligence network. A woman based in Hong Kong who specialized in background investigation on individuals in corporate and organized crime-adjacent structures. I need a full personal financial profile, Nyla said when the woman answered. Ha-Eun Jung, Min-jae's personal assistant. I need everything. Salary history, personal assets, anything that looks like secondary income streams. Timeline? 48 hours, Nyla said. That's tight. I know, Nyla said. Name your price. The next 18 hours were the worst kind. The kind where you have partial information and no good options, and you have to keep moving anyway. She called Priya and told her about the lien. Priya was silent for a full 10 seconds, which was the longest Nyla had ever heard her go without speaking. Can the acquisition proceed with the lien in place? Nyla asked. Not cleanly, Priya said. The consortium's legal team will flag it during due diligence. If there's a legitimate secured interest held by a Hanul-affiliated entity, they're going to want it resolved before close. How do we resolve it? Challenge the lien, which takes months and puts everything in litigation. Or negotiate a release directly with Hanul Properties, which means negotiating with Min-jae. A pause. Or we demonstrate that the clause doesn't create the interest they're claiming, which requires a specific reading of the lease language that I'm not confident a Korean commercial court would adopt. What's the best option? Priya took a breath. Nyla, I have to be honest with you. If this lien holds up, the acquisition is in serious trouble. The hard deadline in the offer is 60 days out. We can't resolve a commercial dispute in 60 days. Then we go around it, Nyla said. Go around. The lien is on the sole subsidiary. The Singapore entity is separate. The patents are registered through the Singapore entity, the core technology. She was thinking out loud now, and she knew it, and she kept going because that was the only way to find the shape of something when you couldn't see it clearly yet. If we restructure the acquisition to target only the Singapore entity and its direct subsidiaries, excluding the sole company entirely, does the lien follow? Priya was quiet. Priya. I'm thinking, Priya said. The sole company's revenue is part of the valuation basis. If we cut it out of the deal structure, the acquisition price drops significantly. How significantly? I'd have to model it. Rough estimate. You lose somewhere between 15 and 25% of the offer value. She closed her eyes for a moment. But the deal closes. Potentially, Priya said, with the reduced structure and if the consortium agrees to the modification. That's not guaranteed. Call the consortium's lead attorney tonight, Nyla said. Not tomorrow, tonight. Frame it as a proactive restructuring for efficiency, not as a response to a legal problem. Nyla, they're going to do their own due diligence. They'll find the lien. Then I'd rather they hear about the solution before they find the problem, she said. Call tonight. The research contact came back in 31 hours, not 48. Nyla was in her apartment. Min-jae had not come home in 2 days, which was the first time in 7 years that it happened, and the apartment had a different quality to it in his absence. Not better or worse exactly, just clarified, like a room that reveals its actual dimensions when you move the furniture out. When the report came through on her encrypted email, she read it at the kitchen table. Ha Eun-jung, 46. 14 years with the Haneul Group. Base salary, standard for the role. Personal assets. An apartment in Mapogu, a small investment portfolio, a savings account whose balance was consistent with her salary history. And one anomaly. A secondary account registered in Ha Eun's mother's name that had received 6 wire transfers over the past 3 years. Each transfer was for an identical amount, 40 million Korean won, approximately 30,000 US dollars per transfer. The transfers originated from a shell company registered in the British Virgin Islands. The BVI company's registered agent was listed as a firm that appeared in 2 other documents Nyla had in her files. Documents connected to a rival criminal organization that the Haneul Group had been in quiet territorial conflict with for nearly a decade. Nyla set the report down. She picked it up again and read the BVI section 3 more times. Ha Eun-jung had been receiving payments from a Haneul rival for 3 years. Ha Eun-jung had filed a legal instrument against Nyla's company 14 months ago and said nothing to Min-jae. Ha Eun-jung had brought the entity discovery to Min-jae's attention, but only after it surfaced through the compliance team, which meant she hadn't controlled the timing. Ha Eun hadn't filed the lien to protect Min-jae. She'd filed it to create a weapon that someone else could use, a contested asset that, at the right moment, could be deployed to destabilize the Haneul Group's financial structure during a major acquisition. The acquisition's existence was now known. Ha Eun had made sure of that by escalating the entity discovery to Min-jae. And if the acquisition collapsed in public litigation involving the Haneul Syndicate's boss and his estranged wife, every regulatory body that had been watching the Haneul Group for years would have a front-row seat to the chaos, which was exactly what a rival organization would want. Nyla sat very still at the kitchen table. She had been running an exit strategy for 14 months. Ha Eun had been running a different operation on a parallel track, using Nyla's own exit as the trigger mechanism. And Min-jae, who was currently meeting with lawyers about his wife's company, had no idea that his most trusted employee had been compromised for 3 years. She picked up her phone. She started to call Daniel, then she stopped. She set the phone down. She looked at the report sitting on the table. If she brought this to Daniel, Daniel would advise her to take it to Min-jae, because exposing Ha Eun's betrayal would theoretically give Min-jae a reason to pull back his legal pressure, to pause Lee Sang-wook, to create space for negotiation. It was the logical play. It was probably what any rational actor in her position would do. But she thought about what handing Min-jae that information would actually mean. She would be saving him. She would be walking back into the role she'd spent 14 months preparing to leave. The wife who managed things for him, who protected him, who made his empire function better than it would without her. She would be useful to him again. And a useful wife did not get to leave on her own terms. She sat with that tension until it stopped feeling like a dilemma and started feeling like a decision. Then she picked up the phone, called a number she'd never expected to call. It rang 4 times. Min-jae answered. "We need to meet," she said. "Not at the apartment, somewhere neutral." A pause. "Why?" he said. "Because someone in your organization has been working against both of us," she said. "And if you don't know about it in the next 24 hours, you're going to lose something a lot more important than a divorce negotiation." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she almost thought he'd ended the call. "Where?" he said. She named a restaurant in Jongno-gu, mid-level, not associated with either of them, the kind of place that minded its own business. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. She ended the call. She sat in the kitchen of the apartment she'd shared with him for 6 years, with the report in front of her and the city outside the window doing what it always did, and she understood with complete clarity that the plan she'd built over 14 months was no longer the plan. The plan had been precise, contained, entirely within her control. What she was walking into now was none of those things. She had to dismantle the betrayal inside his house before the betrayal could destroy her exit, which meant she had to help the man she was leaving in order to finish leaving him, which meant she had to trust that the woman who had built everything from nothing could rebuild the strategy on different ground without losing the thing she'd built it for. She folded the report, placed it in a clean envelope, and set it beside her laptop. Then she went to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers with her clothes still on and stared at the ceiling until the gray soul morning began arriving through the curtains. She got to the restaurant in Jongno-gu at 7:42, 18 minutes early, which was deliberate. She wanted to be seated when he arrived. She wanted to be the one who had already chosen the table, already ordered water, already established the geometry of the room before he walked into it. These were small things, and she was not unaware of how small they were, but small things were what separated a prepared person from a reactive one, and she had spent too long being prepared to abandon the habit now. The restaurant was called Haeyang, a mid-sized Korean traditional place on a side street off Jongno that served set breakfast to office workers and the occasional older couple. The kind of place that had been operating for 20 years without trying to be anything other than what it was. She'd eaten here once before, alone, during a long day of client meetings 2 years ago. She remembered the light. It came in from the east-facing windows in the morning, clean and flat, the kind of light that showed everything clearly. She sat facing the door. She ordered barley tea. She placed the envelope on the table to her right, face down, and put her hands in her lap and made herself breathe evenly for the 7 minutes it took for Min-jae to arrive. He came in at 7:59. He was wearing a dark gray suit with no tie, which was as close as she'd ever seen him come to informal business dress. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well but had decided not to let that be visible, which meant the tiredness showed only in the very specific way his eyes moved when he scanned the room. A fractional slowness, a half-second of adjustment before his gaze found her. He came to the table and sat down without speaking. The server came. He ordered coffee. They waited until it arrived. "Talk," he said. She placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward him. He looked at it, looked at her, then picked it up and opened it. She watched his face while he read. She'd become, over 7 years, a precise reader of his expressions, not because she'd tried to study him, but because living in proximity to someone whose emotional states had operational consequences meant you developed an involuntary fluency in their face. She knew the difference between the stillness that meant he was processing something intellectually and the stillness that meant something had landed in a deeper place than the intellect. What she watched move across his face while he read the Haeyang report was the second kind. He read it twice. She could tell by the way his eyes tracked back to the top of the second page. He read certain sections 3 times. She could see that too, the slight narrowing around his eyes that meant he was parsing language rather than absorbing narrative. Then he set it down on the table. He put both hands around his coffee cup. "When did you get this?" he said. "Last night," she said. The BVI transfers. Verified through 2 separate financial databases," she said. "The shell company has a registration trail that connects to Shin Tae-ryong's organization through 2 intermediary entities. The connection is indirect but traceable." Shin Tae-ryong. She watched the name land. Shin was the head of the Donggang Group, a criminal organization that had been quietly expanding into territories the Hanul Syndicate had controlled for a decade. The territorial friction between the two organizations had been managed through a combination of formal arrangement and mutual deterrence for years, the kind of stability that depended entirely on neither side making a move the other couldn't absorb. Min-jae set his coffee cup down. 3 years, he said. She's been on his payroll for 3 years. The first transfer was 37 months ago, Nyla said. 6 payments, identical amounts, always through the mother's account. Something moved through his jaw. A compression, very brief, quickly controlled. She filed the lien. To create a contested asset that would surface at the moment of maximum exposure, Nyla said. When the acquisition became visible and your legal team was already engaged, the lien gives Shin's people a lever. If the deal collapses in public litigation, every regulator who's been watching Hanul for the past decade has a reason to move. Your financial structure gets scrutinized at the exact moment it's most vulnerable. She handed him a detonator, Min-jae said. And she timed the handoff to my exit, Nyla said. Whether or not that was intentional, whether she knew what I was building or just knew that I was building something, the effect is the same. My acquisition creates the exposure. The lion creates the leverage. Your legal response creates the public record. He was looking at the report again, not reading it now, just looking at it. Why are you telling me this? He said. It was a fair question, and she'd known it was coming. Because Hyun's play only works if your legal team keeps pushing on my entity structure, she said. If Lee Sang-wook files an injunction, we go into litigation, and Shin gets everything he's been waiting for. I told you because the threat to my exit is the same threat to your organization. So this is strategic, he said. Everything is strategic, she said. You know that. I know that. We've both always known that. She paused. That doesn't make it false. He looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He called Lee Sang-wook from the table, right there, without moving away. She didn't try to listen. She picked up her tea and looked toward the window, giving him the nominal privacy of her averted attention, while his voice came to her in low, clipped Korean regardless. Hold the injunction filing, he said. Nothing moves until I say so. A pause. No. Nothing. Tell the team to stand down on the entity research as well. Another pause, longer, during which Nyla could hear the faint sound of Lee Sang-wook's voice expressing the particular form of controlled discomfort that attorneys produced when clients made decisions that contradicted their advice. I understand your concern, Min-jae said. Hold it anyway. He ended the call. She looked back at him. Ha-eun comes in at 9, he said. I need to be back before she arrives. You're going to confront her. I'm going to let her think everything is normal for approximately 40 minutes, he said, while I have Sang-wook's team pull her access credentials and quarantine her communication records. Then I'm going to sit her down. If she knows you have the report, she'll run, he said. I know. He stood. He picked up the report and put it back in the envelope. I'll need your source. My source stays separate, she said. What you have in that envelope is enough to build your own case. He looked at her. Min-jae. She kept her voice even. I just handed you evidence that your most senior employee has been working against you for 3 years. I did that at a direct cost to my own legal position. The source is mine. A long pause. Fine, he said. He reached into his jacket and put enough cash on the table to cover both of them, which was an automatic gesture, the kind of thing you did after 7 years without thinking about it. And she watched him register what he'd done a half second after he'd done it. Watched him briefly consider taking the money back and then leave it there. He left without looking at her again. She sat for another 10 minutes after he was gone. She drank her tea. She watched the morning light on the restaurant floor shift slightly as a cloud moved somewhere over the city. Then she called Priya. The injunction is on hold, she said when Priya picked up. We have a window. How fast can you get the consortium's attorneys to agree to the restructured deal? I spoke with them last night, Priya said. Their lead attorney wants a formal written proposal before they'll take it to their investment committee. I can have the proposal drafted by tonight. Do it, Nyla said. What's the reduced valuation looking like? If we exclude the sole subsidiary entirely and the lien with it, we're looking at approximately $760 million, Priya said. That's a reduction of roughly $180 million from the original offer. $180 million. She absorbed that number the way she absorbed all large numbers. Not with shock, not with grief, but with a clear-eyed accounting of what it meant and what it didn't mean. The patents are intact, she said. All 17 primary patents are registered through Singapore, Priya said. They're clean, no encumbrance, no competing claim. Then the core technology is untouched, Nyla said. The sole subsidiary is operations and revenue history. Without it, the valuation drops, but the underlying asset is the same. Correct. Send the proposal tonight, Nyla said. And Priya, put a 48-hour response deadline in the terms. I don't want this sitting in their committee for 2 weeks. They won't like a 48-hour deadline. They'll accept it, she said. The technology is what they're buying. They've been in discussions for 9 months. They're not walking away over timeline pressure. A pause. Okay, Priya said. Pick up. Ha-yun was at her desk at 8:58. Min-jae watched her arrive on the security feed from a secondary monitor in his private office. Watched her set her bag down with the precise habit of someone who had occupied the same space for 9 years, hang her coat on the hook behind her chair, open her laptop, and begin her morning review of his calendar with the focused efficiency that had made her for nearly a decade the most valuable non-executive in his organization. He watched her for 4 minutes. Then he called her in. She came through his office door with a notepad and her phone, ready for the standard morning briefing. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she'd sat in thousands of times, and looked at him with the alert, composed attention that was her professional baseline. He said nothing for a moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. "Close the door," he said. She stood, closed it, and came back to the chair. "There's something I need to run by you," he said. "The Mapogu office building. The property review from last quarter flagged a tenant irregularity in the commercial lease database. Ha-yun, can you pull the lease file for Unit 7C? He watched her face while he said it. A person who was entirely innocent would have reached for their phone without hesitation, already mentally accessing the property management system. A person who knew exactly what was in that unit would show something, a pause, a recalibration, a fraction of a second where the internal process was different from the external presentation. Ha-yun showed him a pause. Brief, expertly managed. She smoothed it into a neutral expression so fast that a less observant person would have missed it entirely. He did not miss it. "Of course," she said. She opened her phone. He let her look. He watched her realize, over approximately 45 seconds of fabricated searching, that the question wasn't really about a lease database irregularity. He watched her understand, in the way that experienced people understood things, not through a single signal, but through the accumulation of several small ones, that the morning had changed in a fundamental way. She looked up from her phone. "I don't see a Unit 7C in the current tenant registry," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "No," he said. "You wouldn't." Silence. "Ha-yun," he said. "How long have you been working for Shintai Ryong?" The silence that followed had a specific texture, not the silence of confusion or innocence, but the silence of a person making a rapid series of calculations about what denial would cost versus what it would gain. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He opened his desk drawer and placed the report on the desk between them. She looked at it. He saw her see her mother's name on the account header. He saw the color change in her face. Not a dramatic thing, not something visible from distance, but up close, across a desk, undeniable. "The first transfer was 37 months ago," he said. "BVI company, your mother's savings account." He paused. 6 payments. She didn't look up from the report. "Ha-yun." His voice dropped. Not soft, quiet the way cold rooms were quiet. "Look at me." She looked up. "Why?" he said. She held his gaze for a long time. Something moved through her face, not remorse, not fear exactly, but something older and more complicated than either of those things. The look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was now being asked to put it down in front of the person it was going to land on. "My brother," she said. 4 years ago. He got into debt with Shin's people. He couldn't pay. They were going to... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "They said if I cooperated, the debt would be cleared. And you cooperated." "For 6 months," she said. I gave them logistics information. Low level. Nothing that what? His voice sharpened. Nothing that cost anyone? Nothing that gave them anything real? He leaned forward. Ha-Yun, you filed a legal instrument against my organization using your access to my property systems. You created a weapon and handed it to my enemy and told yourself it was nothing? She looked down at the desk. The Lian, he said. Was that Shin's instruction? A pause. Yes, she said. When? 14 months ago. And the entity discovery last week? I didn't manufacture that, she said quickly. The compliance team found it on their own. She stopped. You escalated it, he said, when you could have buried it. She said nothing. He sat back. He looked at her for a long time, 9 years. She'd been in that chair, across that desk, for 9 years. She'd managed his schedule, protected his information, navigated his professional life with a competence that had been genuinely irreplaceable. He'd trusted her more than most people who shared his blood. Get your things, he said. Her head came up. Your personal items, he said, from your desk. You have 20 minutes. After that, security will escort you out and your access will be revoked. He paused. Your brother's debt is cleared. I'll handle that separately. What you did, I understand why you did it. That doesn't make it survivable for you here. She sat completely still for a moment. Then she stood. She walked to the door. Min-jae. She stopped without turning around. Her voice had a different quality now. Stripped of the professional layer, just the voice of someone who had worked beside a person for 9 years and was standing at the last moment of it. The Lian, even if you resolve it, Shin isn't going to stop. Whatever your wife has built, he's going to come at it from another direction. I know, Min-jae said. She left. He gave himself 3 minutes. He sat at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and gave himself exactly 3 minutes, and then he picked up his phone and called Nyla. She answered on the second ring. It's done, he said. Ha-Eun? Gone. He paused. She confirmed Shin's involvement. The Lian was his play. Another pause. She also said he's going to keep pushing regardless of how you resolve it. A silence on the other end. Not the silence of surprise. I know, she said. Nyla. He stopped. Min-jae. Her voice was even. Whatever you're about to say, don't. Not right now. He closed his mouth. I need 48 hours, she said. If the acquisition closes, the Lian becomes irrelevant because the sole subsidiary transfers out of my control as part of the deal structure. Shin loses his leverage. And if it doesn't close in 48 hours? Then we have a different problem, she said. But I've spent 14 months making sure it closes. The consortium's response came in 31 hours. Nyla was in the Gangnam hub, the backup office she'd shifted her team to 3 days earlier, when Priya called at 4 in the afternoon. She was standing at a whiteboard going over a structural chart with Chaelin, who had adapted to the office relocation with the unsentimental flexibility of someone who understood that her job was to make the technology work wherever it needed to work. She stepped away from the whiteboard. They accepted the restructured terms, Priya said. She put her hand against the wall. All of them? She said. With one modification, Priya said. They want the closing escrow held by a neutral third-party institution rather than the Singapore firm we proposed. Cosmetic change, no substantive impact. Accept it, Nyla said. I already did, Priya said. Conditionally, pending your confirmation. You have it, she said. When does the formal agreement execute? If both parties sign the amended term sheet by Friday, we move to final close in 30 days. 30 days. Priya, she said. Yes. Good work, she said. All of it. The whole 14 months. A pause. Get some sleep, Priya said. You sound like someone who hasn't in a while. She almost laughed. It came out as something quieter than that. Friday, she said. Keep me updated on every step. She ended the call and stood with her hand still against the wall for a moment. Then she went back to the whiteboard. The acquisition is restructuring to close, she told Chaelin. I need you to prepare the full technical documentation for the patent portfolio. Everything the consortium's integration team will need for the handoff. Chaelin had worked for her long enough to know that this was the moment they'd been building toward. She didn't celebrate. She didn't ask questions. She picked up her pen and wrote the first item on her own notepad. Timeline? Kaylin said. 5 days, Nyla said. Kaylin wrote it down. Shin Tae-ryong moved on the third day. She didn't know it was him at first. What she knew was that at 6:40 in the morning, 2 days before the term sheet was scheduled for signature, Daniel Yu called her in a controlled state of alarm to tell her that someone had filed an emergency injunction application in Seoul Central District Court, seeking to freeze all transactions involving entities connected to the Mapogu office address, naming her Singapore company as a co-respondent. Not Min-jae's legal team. A different law firm entirely. One she'd never encountered. She sat in her car outside the Gangnam hub, she'd been about to go in, and listened to Daniel with the phone pressed hard against her ear while the morning traffic moved on the street outside. Who filed it? She said. A commercial law firm called Baekhyun Partners, Daniel said. I've never dealt with them directly, but they have a reputation for Nyla. They work almost exclusively for Donggang. Shin, Hae-yoon had been right. He wasn't waiting for the lien to do the work. He'd seen the lien's leverage evaporating, and he'd moved directly. What does the injunction application allege? She said. Fraudulent asset structuring, Daniel said. The allegation is that the Singapore entity was set up specifically to circumvent Korean commercial law, using a foreign registration to shield assets from legitimate claims. It's a weak argument legally, but it doesn't have to be strong. It just has to create enough procedural noise to delay the acquisition closing past the deadline. If it goes to a hearing, emergency injunction applications can be heard within 72 hours, Daniel said. If they get a sympathetic judge and an expedited hearing, we could be looking at a freeze order by Thursday. Thursday. The term sheet signature was Friday. Challenge it, she said. File a response today. I don't care what it costs. I'm already drafting, he said. But Nyla, if they get an expedited hearing, we're going to need to appear. And appearing means this is no longer quiet. It was never going to stay quiet, she said. She ended the call and sat in the car for 10 seconds. Then she called Min-jae. He answered immediately, which meant he'd been awake. It was 6:45 in the morning. Shin filed an emergency injunction application this morning, she said, against my Singapore entity. Fraudulent asset structuring. A pause. He's trying to kill the acquisition before Friday, Min-jae said. Yes. What do you need? She'd thought about this on the 10-second drive between ending Daniel's call and making this one. She'd thought about it and come to a conclusion that she didn't love but could live with. I need Hanoel Group to submit a voluntary statement to the court, she said, confirming that the Singapore entity operated independently from any Hanoel-affiliated structure and that Hanoel asserts no claim against it. Silence. That's a formal legal document, he said, signed by my organization, submitted to a public court. It negates the fraudulent structuring allegation, she said. Without a Hanoel claim to point to, Shin's application has nothing to stand on. It also formally abandons any position I might have on the Seoul subsidiary. Yes, she said. It does. The silence lasted long enough that she counted it. 8 seconds. And if I do that, he said slowly, Shin's application collapses. Your acquisition closes. The divorce proceeds on your terms. Yes, she said. And what do I get? She'd thought about this too. You get the evidence that Ha-yoon was compromised, she said. My research contacts full file, not just the summary I gave you. Enough to take to the Financial Intelligence Unit and make Shin's BVI structure visible to the regulators who've been trying to find it for years. You hand Shin to the government, and you do it with clean hands, because the evidence came from your wife's independent operation, not from your own. He absorbed that. You've been holding the full file back, he said. I needed to know if you'd submit the statement first, she said. I'm telling you now what I'm offering. Another pause. Send me Daniel Yu's direct line, but, he said. I'll have Lee Sang-wook call him within the hour. Thank you, she said. Don't, he said. His voice had a quality she couldn't quite identify, not bitterness, not generosity. Something in between, the tone of a man settling an account he'd run up without fully understanding what the interest would come to. He ended the call. Lee Sang-wook called Daniel Yu at 7:53 in the morning. By 10:15, Hanoel Group's formal statement had been drafted, reviewed, and signed. By noon, Daniel had filed the response to Shin's injunction application, attaching the Haneul statement as a primary exhibit. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Nyla spent that afternoon in the Gangnam hub with Shaylin and two other members of her technical team, finalizing the patent documentation. She worked with the kind of focus that exists on the other side of crisis. Not calm exactly, but resolved, the state of a person who has done everything available to them and is now waiting for external forces to finish their movement. At 3 in the afternoon, her phone rang. Unknown number, Korean mobile prefix. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Ms. Brooks? The voice was male, measured, with the particular quality of someone who is accustomed to being listened to. My name is Shin Tae-ryong. She said nothing. I think we should talk, he said. Directly, without attorneys. She kept her voice level. What would we talk about? The injunction, he said. I'm willing to withdraw it. Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. She kept her face still. Kaylin was 6 feet away, pretending to review a document. Under what terms? She said. A meeting, he said. Tonight, you and I, private. I'm not meeting you privately, she said. Ms. Brooks. A pause. I have no interest in your acquisition. My interest is in the Haneul Group's financial vulnerability. You understand that. You've clearly done enough research to understand that. Another pause. What I'm offering is a withdrawal that protects your closing timeline. In exchange, I want information. Specifically, what you know about Haneul's financial structure from 7 years inside it. The room seemed to tighten. You want me to hand you my husband's organization, she said. Former husband, he said, or close enough. She looked at the whiteboard across the room, the structural chart. Kaylin's neat additions to the lower section, the patent numbers in their rows. If I give you anything about Haneul's structure, she said, I'm not protecting myself. I'm becoming exactly what Ha-yun was. Ha-yun worked for money, Shin said. You'd be working for your own exit. No, she said. A pause. No? He said. Withdraw the injunction or don't, she said. I'll see you in court tomorrow morning. She ended the call. Her hand was shaking slightly. Not badly, not visibly from across the room, but she could feel it. A fine tremor in her fingers that was her body registering what her voice hadn't let through. She set the phone down on the desk and put both palms flat on the surface and breathed once, slowly. Kaylin looked up. You okay? Kaylin said. I'm fine, Nyla said. Keep going on section 3. She called Min-jae at 5 in the afternoon and told him about Shin's call. She told him everything, the offer, the terms, what she'd said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence on the line had a different quality than his earlier silences. This one had weight in it, the weight of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation in real time. He called you directly, Min-jae said. Yes. That means he's running out of moves, he said. If he had a strong play, he wouldn't be asking you for intelligence. He'd just make the play. That's what I thought, she said. The court tomorrow. If the Haneul statement holds up as Exhibit 1, the fraudulent structuring allegation falls apart, she said. Daniel thinks the judge will dismiss it without a full hearing. And if he's wrong? Then we argue it, she said, and we buy time. A long pause. Nyla. His voice had changed. The professional layer was gone, not replaced by anything soft, but by something unguarded, which on him looked almost the same. What you turned down tonight, that was, don't, she said. The same word he'd used with her that morning. He stopped. We're not there yet, she said. Let's get through tomorrow. She ended the call. She worked until 9 in the evening. She drove home alone. She ate something standing at the kitchen counter. She didn't remember afterward what it was. And then she sat at the table with a notepad and went over every possible scenario the following morning could produce. There were 6. She built a response tree for each one. She finished at 11:40. She went to bed. She lay in the dark with the apartment around her. Quiet, in the way it had been quiet since Min-jae stopped coming home. The clarified silence of a space that was already partway through becoming something else. Through the window, Seoul burned the way it always burned. Indifferent, enormous, continuing. Tomorrow the court would open its doors at 9. At 9:15, a judge would sit down with two competing legal arguments and begin deciding which one had standing. Everything she had built, every patent, every algorithm, every year of invisible work inside a marriage that had slowly become a construction site, was sitting in that courtroom in a manila folder. She lay still. She breathed. Outside, somewhere across the Han River, a siren moved through the city and faded. She was still awake when midnight passed, lying with her eyes open, running the response trees one more time in the dark, until they were as solid as she could make them. She had done everything available to her. The rest would have to be decided somewhere she couldn't control. That had always been the part she hated most. She got to Seoul Central District Court at 8:47. The building was the kind of structure that made no promises. Gray stone, functional, built to process the weight of human dispute without absorbing any of it. She'd been inside it twice before on client matters in earlier years, and both times she'd noticed the same thing. The hallways smelled of paper and floor wax, and the specific institutional quiet of a place where people came when they'd run out of other options. She wore the charcoal suit, 4 years old, bought during a difficult arbitration in her 3rd year of marriage when she'd spent 11 days preparing to dismantle an opposing argument piece by piece in a room not unlike this one. She'd won that proceeding. She'd worn this suit. She didn't believe in luck. She believed in preparation and pattern recognition, and the pattern she was working with this morning was simple. Wear the thing that was there the last time you held your ground under pressure and held it completely. Daniel Yu was on the courthouse steps when she arrived. He had his leather portfolio under his arm and the particular quality of alert stillness that experienced litigators developed. Not nervous energy, but coiled readiness, the body already inside the room. It was about to enter. He'd been awake since 5, she guessed. She'd been awake since 4. Any withdrawal from Shin's side overnight, she said. Nothing, Daniel said. They're going forward. She'd set the probability of voluntary withdrawal at 12% after Shin's call the previous evening. She'd been right. She was almost always right about those numbers, which was the thing that had made her valuable and the thing that Min-jae had slowly stopped being able to tolerate. She filed that thought away and focused. The Hanuel statement, she said, filed and accepted. It's in the judge's pre-hearing review file. Daniel paused. Judge is Park Hyun-soo, 22 years. Commercial law specialist. He reads everything before he walks in. Good, she said. She climbed the steps. Inside, the hearing room was smaller than she'd visualized during her scenario building the previous night. A mid-level civil chamber with long wooden benches, fluorescent light competing with flat October sun from 2 east-facing windows, a clerk's desk already occupied. The Baekhyun Partners team was already seated at the applicant's table. 2 attorneys, both younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, the kind of sharpness that came exclusively from high-pressure commercial litigation. The lead one glanced at her when she entered. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then moved to the respondent's table without hurrying. She sat down. Daniel laid out 5 documents left to right on the table. She recognized the sequencing from their preparation session the previous afternoon. She looked at the arrangement, then looked at the front wall of the room and regulated her breathing the way she regulated everything, quietly, without drawing attention to the act. At 9:07, Lee Sang-wook entered. She hadn't known he was coming. Min-jae had authorized the statement, but she hadn't expected his chief legal counsel to appear in person at a proceeding that Min-jae was not formally a party to. Lee Sang-wook was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the deliberate economy of movement that came from decades of high-stakes courtroom work. He moved to the gallery section, the correct position for a non-party submitting supporting documentation, and sat 2 rows behind her without speaking. She turned once. He gave a single nod. Nothing more. She faced front. At 9:14, Judge Park Hyun-soo entered the room and everyone stood. The Baekhyun Partners' lead attorney introduced himself as Choi Jun-seok, and within the first 90 seconds of his presentation, she understood exactly why Shin had hired him. He didn't perform. He didn't reach for drama. He built his argument the way an engineer builds a load-bearing structure. From the foundation up, each element placed before the next was introduced. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. His core allegation was this, that her Singapore entity had been registered using a Korean residential contact address in its original filing, a correction made 8 months later, but a correction Choi was using to argue deliberate obscuring of Korean regulatory jurisdiction. Combined with the Mapogu commercial lease and the collateral clause in subsection 14, he was constructing a picture of a structure designed from inception to move Korean-generated revenue offshore without appropriate disclosure to Korean financial authorities. It was, as Daniel had assessed, legally weak. The residential address technicality had been corrected within the permissible amendment window. The collateral clause argument required accepting that a standard boilerplate property lease term constituted a meaningful regulatory connection, a stretch that would require a sympathetic reading of commercial law that most experienced judges wouldn't provide. But Choi presented it without apparent uncertainty, and the absence of apparent uncertainty gave the argument a credibility it didn't technically deserve. She watched Judge Park's face while Choi spoke. The judge's expression gave away almost nothing. 22 years of professional stillness was not something you penetrated from across a courtroom. But his eyes moved, and she tracked them, and 3 separate times during Choi's 15-minute presentation. She watched the judge's gaze drop to the document on his bench that she recognized as the Hanewell Statement, 3 times. The same document. That was not a man looking for context. That was a man who had already formed a view and was checking it. When Choi concluded and sat down, Judge Park looked at Daniel. "Respondent," he said. Daniel stood. He spoke for 13 minutes. She'd heard the structure of it the day before, but the courtroom version had been refined overnight into something leaner and more precise. All the rehearsal redundancy stripped away, leaving only the essential sequence. He walked through the Singapore registration in clean chronological order, establishing the legitimate capital origin, the independence of the company's founding from any Hanewell-affiliated resource, the unbroken chain of sole directorship from registration to the present day. Then he reached the Hanewell Statement. He picked it up from the table and held it without theatrics. Just held it, the physical presence of the document doing quiet work in the room's attention. "Your Honor, the applicant's fraudulent structuring claim requires a Hanewell nexus in order to function. The Lion instrument, which provides the applicant's only substantive standing in this matter, derives its claimed authority from a Hanewell Group property management mechanism. Without a Hanewell interest to anchor that claim, the Lion instrument has no subject matter on which to operate." He set the statement down. "The Hanewell Group has submitted a formal voluntary statement to this court confirming that no claim exists against the respondent's Singapore entity, that the entity operated entirely independently of any Hanewell-affiliated capital or direction, and that Hanewell Properties K.R. asserts no interest of any kind in or against the respondent's business operations." He paused for one beat. "The applicant's claim requires a Hanewell nexus. There is no Hanewell nexus. This application should be dismissed." He sat down. Judge Park looked at the statement on his bench. He looked at Choi. The judge's voice, when it came, was entirely level. No inflection of judgment, no telegraphed outcome, just the clean procedural precision of someone who had made his decision and was confirming it through questions rather than announcing it prematurely. "Counsel," Judge Park said to Choi, "your applicant's standing in this matter derives primarily from a lien instrument filed against a commercial property address in Mapogu. Is that the foundation of the standing argument?" Choi stood. "That is one component of a multi-basis argument, Your Honor. The structuring irregularities identified in the— Is the lien instrument the primary basis of standing?" the judge said again. A pause. Brief, but visible. "Yes, Your Honor. The entity through which the lien instrument was filed, it has a connection to your applicant's organizational structure?" Another pause, shorter this time, because Choi understood where the questioning was going and had already decided that resistance would cost more than acknowledgement. "Through an intermediary property mechanism, Your Honor, yes. The Hanewell Group, which owns the property from which the lien instrument's authority derives, has submitted a statement to this court disavowing any interest in the respondent's operations," the judge said. "If the lien instrument's legitimate authority requires a Hanewell interest, and Hanewell formally disavows that interest, on what basis does your applicant's standing survive?" The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. She sat completely still with her hands in her lap and her back straight against the chair, and she counted 4 seconds of silence in a sole courtroom while a man across the room tried to locate solid ground that wasn't there. Choi looked at his documents. He looked at his co-counsel, who had the careful expression of someone who would have no helpful information to offer and knew it. He looked back at the judge. Your Honor, the applicant maintains that the underlying structuring irregularities exist independently of the application is denied, Judge Park said. She felt it arrive in her chest not as triumph, but as the release of a load-bearing tension. The kind of release that doesn't feel like joy because the thing being released was never joyful. It was just weight. And what you feel when weight lifts is not happiness, but the sudden awareness of your own uprightness, the fact that you are still standing. The emergency injunction application is dismissed, the judge said. The existing protective order on the sole subsidiary remains in place pending the underlying commercial matter, but no freeze of transaction activity connected to the Singapore entity is authorized. Court is adjourned. He stood. The room stood. She remained seated for 3 seconds after everyone else had risen. 3 seconds of sitting in a chair in a sole courtroom while the room moved around her, while the Bacon Partners attorneys gathered their documents with the controlled movements of professionals managing a professional setback, while Daniel quietly organized his portfolio beside her, while somewhere behind her, Lee Sang-wook rose from the gallery bench. 3 seconds of letting the weight be gone before she put the next thing in its place. Then she stood. Outside, the October morning had broken into something almost clear. The flat gray of the earlier sky thinned and pulled back to reveal a pale, honest blue that had no warmth in it, but at least was not pretending to be anything other than what a late autumn morning in Seoul actually was. Lee Sang-wook came down the courthouse steps behind her and stopped 2 steps above, which put them at nearly the same eye level. The statement is filed, he said. Part of the public record now. He paused. Whatever personal matters exist between you and Mr. Kang, the organization has formally removed itself from the acquisition dispute. That's the extent of what I was authorized to do here today. I understand, she said. Tell him thank you. Lee Sang-wook looked at her with an expression she'd seen before on men who'd spent long careers watching powerful people make irreversible decisions. Not judgment exactly, but a kind of careful attention, the look of someone filing an observation away in a place they didn't often revisit. He'll hear it better from you, Lee Sang-wook said. He descended the remaining steps and turned left on the sidewalk without looking back. Daniel appeared at her shoulder. The term sheet signature is Friday, he said. Priya confirmed the consortium's attorneys are ready on their end. Good, she said. He said her name with a weight she hadn't heard from him before in 11 months of professional collaboration, and she looked at him. Daniel Yu, who had never once asked her a personal question or made a remark outside the scope of their working relationship, who had filed documents at 6:15 in the morning without complaint and appeared in court today without being asked, who understood implicitly that some clients were managing things that extended well beyond the legal work without needing those things to be explained. Are you all right? He said. She looked at his face, careful, tired, genuinely asking. Not entirely, she said. But enough. He nodded. She went down the steps. She called her mother from the car. She sat in the parking area outside the courthouse with the engine running and the heater starting to push warm air against the cold that had gotten into the car during the hearing, and she called Atlanta before she called anyone else. Before Priya, before Chalin, before she sent the message to the consortium's lead attorney that she'd already drafted in her head. Her mother answered on the third ring with the particular quality of someone who had been waiting without wanting to announce it. Baby, her mother said. Hey, Mama. You sound different. Something finished today, Nyla said. Something I've been working on for a long time. Her mother was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was understanding something larger than what had been stated. The thing you couldn't tell me about. Most of it, Nyla said. And? It's going to be okay, she said. I'm going to be okay. Her mother let out a slow breath. Not of relief exactly, because her mother had never fully believed that Nyla wouldn't be okay, but of something releasing, the specific exhale of a person who has been holding a quiet, sustained worry for a long time and can now set it down. When are you coming home? Her mother said. A month, she said. Maybe 5 weeks. I have things to close out here. I'll make the sweet potato thing. I've been thinking about it since last Tuesday, Nyla said. It came out almost like a laugh. Almost. You come home and eat properly, her mother said. You always forget to eat when you're working hard. I know, she said. Mama, I'm here. Thank you, she said. For what exactly she didn't specify. She didn't need to. Her mother had been the woman who'd gotten up every morning in a house with an 11-year-old daughter, and a bank account that required careful management and a job that didn't stop requiring things simply because other things also required them, and had done it without complaint, without self-pity, without the performance of sacrifice. She'd just done it. The way Nyla had just done what she'd spent 14 months doing. The lineage of that was not something that needed to be spoken. "Don't thank me," her mother said. "Just come home." The term sheet was signed on Friday morning in the offices of the consortium's sole attorneys, a conference room on the 27th floor of a building in Gangnam, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave onto a view of the Han River on a clear day. And today was clear enough that she could see it. The river, the bridges, the flat gray-silver surface of the water holding the late October light, the way water held light in Korea, without glamorizing it. She sat at the long conference table with Daniel to her left, and Priya on video conference from Singapore, and she signed her name across 31 pages in the precise, unhurried handwriting she'd developed in her early 20s and never changed. The handwriting of someone who understood that a signature was not a formality, but a commitment, and should look like one. The same pressure on the pen from the first page to the 31st. The same loop on the B of Brooks that she'd made since the first independent contract she'd ever signed in a borrowed Singapore office at 24 years old. So nervous her hand had been damp on the pen, so determined that the nervousness hadn't made it into the signature itself. The consortium's lead representative was a Danish woman named Mette Sorensen, who had flown from Copenhagen for the signing and who had spent 9 months being the hardest person in the room, the one who had pushed back on every valuation component, challenged every technology claim, demanded the documentation behind the documentation behind the documentation. She'd been relentless in the particular way of people who had survived long enough in institutional finance to distrust anything that appeared to work as cleanly as it appeared to work. Somewhere during month 6, Nyla had stopped seeing Mette's skepticism as an obstacle and started seeing it as a form of respect. The questions were hard because Mette understood enough to know which questions to ask. You only asked the precise, difficult questions if you were taking the thing seriously. When the last signature page was done, and the notary had completed the certification, and the documents had been countersigned by Mette's team, the room had the particular quality of a place from which sustained tension had just departed. Not loud, not celebratory, just different. The air slightly changed. Mette looked across the table. "Ms. Brooks," she said, $760 million for technology that will redefine how institutional risk is assessed globally. She paused, and something in her face, but not warmth exactly, but a form of professional acknowledgement that carried more weight than warmth in these rooms, settled into place. "Frankly, we're acquiring it at a discount." Nyla looked at her. "I know," she said. Mette almost smiled. It reached the corners of her eyes and stopped there, which on her was as much as anyone got. "I hope you know what you're building next," she said, "because we'll want to be in the room for that conversation when it's time." "I'll be in touch," Nyla said. Well, the divorce finalized 11 days later. It was conducted entirely without spectacle, which was how she'd structured it from the beginning. Private proceedings, prepared agreements, attorneys who had done the substantive work in advance, so that the formal appearance required nothing except the presence of both parties to confirm what had already been decided. She wore the charcoal suit again, not for symbolic reasons, but because it was a good suit and appropriate for a courthouse. And she had stopped assigning the charcoal suit to anything other than being a good suit, appropriate for a courthouse. Min-jae was already in the hallway outside the proceedings room when she arrived. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, which she recognized from the morning he'd come to Haiyang, the version of him that was as close to unguarded as he allowed himself in semi-public spaces. He looked thinner than he had 6 weeks ago. Not ill. Lighter in the way of someone from whom something heavy had been removed or had fallen off, or who had finally set it down. The proceedings took 40 minutes. The terms had been agreed in advance. Her company and all its assets were fully hers with no encumbrance. The sole subsidiary had been resolved through a negotiated commercial settlement. She'd paid Hanol Properties a final lease termination fee that was structured to make the lien release clean and technically unremarkable, a number she'd calculated specifically to be large enough to be meaningful to Min-jae's organization without being large enough to constitute the kind of payment that would imply she'd been in a weaker position than she had been. The divorce settlement itself was financially straightforward, because she had no financial entanglement with the Hanewell syndicate. She never had. She'd made certain of that across 7 years with a precision she could now, looking back, fully recognize as not just strategic, but survival-oriented, in ways she hadn't entirely acknowledged to herself at the time. When the formal portion was done and their attorneys were completing the final document exchange in the clerk's office, she and Min-jae stood in the hallway, 6 feet apart, not looking at each other, and then both looking at each other at the same moment in the involuntary synchrony that developed between people who had shared a bed for 7 years. The body's habit of orienting toward a familiar presence even after the reasons for orientation were gone. He looked at her. She looked at him. Ha-yun, she said. Cooperating with the financial regulators, he said. The full file you gave me. It started a chain. Shin's BVI structure is under formal investigation. His Korea operations are being audited. He paused. It'll take years to resolve fully. But it started, she said. It started. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. She told me in the interview with my counsel, Ha-eun. She said she knew you were building something in the Mapogu office within the first 6 months. She found the lease anomaly during a routine property review. Nyla absorbed that. And she sat on it for 5 years. She said, he stopped, pressed his mouth together for a moment. She said she sat on it because she could tell what you were building was going to be extraordinary, and she didn't want to be the one who stopped it. A pause. She sat on it and let Shin file the lien because she thought she could protect both things. She was wrong about that. Nyla stood with that for a moment. 5 years. Hyun had known for 5 years, had watched her work in 3 rooms in a building she wasn't supposed to be in, had decided not to bring it to Min-jae. The complexity of that, the multiple loyalties operating simultaneously, the impossible position of a woman caught between the person she worked for and the person she'd inadvertently decided to protect, was something Nyla couldn't fully untangle standing in a courthouse hallway, and she'd decided sometime in the past 2 weeks that she didn't need to untangle it. Some human situations didn't resolve into clean moral geometry. They just were what they were. She made a terrible choice, Nyla said, and she made it for reasons that weren't entirely terrible. Min-jae looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, but recognition. The look of a man encountering a perspective that reframed something he'd been carrying with only one interpretation available. I never tried to take what you built, he said. It came out with the texture of something that had been held for weeks before being spoken. When Lee Sang-wook told me what I was looking at legally, my first instinct, before any of the legal analysis, was to protect it. What you'd made. He looked at the hallway floor again. I understand that doesn't retroactively. It matters, she said. Not the way it would have mattered earlier, but it matters. He nodded slowly. I spent 7 years convinced that what made our marriage work was what I brought to it, he said. The position, the resources, the access. And I understood at some point, somewhere in the middle of it, that I was wrong about that. But I understood it the wrong way. I turned it into a threat instead of a gift. He looked directly at her. I turned your intelligence into a threat because I couldn't figure out what else to do with it, once it was bigger than my idea of what you were supposed to be. She held his gaze. I know, she said. I'm sorry, he said. Not for a specific itemized thing. For the whole shape of it, the 7-year arc of a marriage that had started in Singapore as something genuine and slowly became a place where the most valuable person in the room had to hide her most valuable qualities to stay intact. I believe you, she said. And I want you to hear that I don't think you're a bad man. I think you're a man who reached a limit he didn't know he had, and who handled it badly for a long time, and who is now standing in a courthouse having a genuinely honest conversation. She paused. That last part, that's not nothing. He stood with that for a moment. Their attorneys came back down the corridor. The final exchange took 4 minutes. She walked out of the courthouse into a Thursday morning in late October with the sky doing what Korean skies did in late October. A clean, hard blue with nothing soft in it, the kind of sky that made the city look like a photograph of itself. She stood on the steps for a moment, just stood. Let the cold air hit her face. Let the city noise come in, traffic, a bus, someone's phone, playing something 3 steps below her on the sidewalk. Let herself be a person standing outside a courthouse in Seoul on a clear, cold morning with everything behind her that was behind her and everything ahead of her that was ahead of her, and no story anymore about which was heavier. Then she went to her car and drove to the Gangnam hub. The operational transition to the consortium's integration team took 6 weeks longer than projected, which she had anticipated even if she hadn't announced the anticipation. These handoffs always took longer. The gap between what a system's creator understood about it and what any external team could absorb in a defined time frame was a gap she'd modeled in other contexts for years, and she'd known intellectually that living through it from the creator's side would be its own particular kind of difficult. It was. Not because the consortium's team was inadequate, they were good, several of them genuinely excellent, but because Siri at its core was the product of a particular mode of thinking that she'd developed over 20 years, and the process of making that thinking transmissible was not a documentation problem, it was a translation problem, and translation at that level of complexity resisted compression. Kaylin served as the primary technical bridge and was, as Nyla had assessed 18 months earlier when she'd first recognized her, genuinely extraordinary. The kind of intellect that understood not just the what of the system, but the why underneath the what, and could articulate the why in language that the consortium's integration team could work with. There were days during the transition period when Nyla sat in a meeting watching Chaylin explain a component of the predictive architecture and thought, she's going to be better at this than I was. Not immediately, not for years, but eventually. That was the right outcome. That was what building something correctly produced. It produced people who could take it further than you could. On the final day of the technical handoff, after the consortium's integration lead had signed off on the documentation and the last of the team meetings had concluded, Nyla and Chaylin sat in the Gangnam hub alone. The office had that particular quality of a place that was in the process of ceasing to be what it had been. Some of the equipment already marked for transfer, the whiteboards cleaned, the coffee machine unplugged and sitting on the counter in a way that made it look like a piece of furniture in someone else's house. "The filing cabinet's going with you?" Kaylin said. She was looking at it in the corner, gray-green, second-hand, the stiff top drawer, the scratches on the lower left. "It goes everywhere I go," Nyla said. Kaylin nodded, not asking why, because she'd worked with Nyla long enough to understand that some things had reasons that didn't need explaining. "You told me," Chaylin said carefully, "that you're building something new, smaller first, different architecture." "Yes." "I've been thinking about what the next version of predictive modeling could look like," Kaylin said, "if we weren't constrained by the structural limitations we worked around in Siri. If we could build from scratch with the lessons already in the foundation." She paused. "I have some ideas." Nyla looked at her. "Show me," she said. Chaylin opened her laptop. They sat in the mostly empty office for 2 more hours, and by the end of it, something that wasn't yet a plan, but was clearly the precursor to one had taken shape on the whiteboard in Chaylin's handwriting, and Nyla was sitting with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted in the posture she adopted when something was showing her its actual structure rather than its apparent one. And the filing cabinet was in the corner where it always was. And outside the Gangnam hub, Seoul was doing what Seoul did at 7 in the evening, moving, generating, completely indifferent to the fact that inside a small office, 2 women had just begun drawing the blueprint of what would come next. She flew to Atlanta on a Tuesday. 14 hours. She slept for 6 of them, not the managed, alert half-sleep of someone who needed to be functional on landing, but the formless, deep sleep of genuine exhaustion finally given permission to finish its work. She woke somewhere over the Pacific with 4 hours remaining and the cabin dark around her and the specific piece of a person who has been moving fast for a long time and has just fully stopped. She opened her laptop. At the top of the document she'd started 3 days earlier, she'd written, "Architecture for what comes next." Below it, 4 pages she'd drafted on a previous flight. The foundational principles, the raw version of what Siri had been built on, written without the corporate or academic framing, written as she'd first understood it at 26 in a Singapore office in the middle of the night. She read what she'd written. Then she kept going. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, in the particular state that came sometimes when the conditions were exactly right. The right exhaustion, the right silence, the right quality of moving through the dark, in a pressurized tube above an ocean, with no appointments, no phones ringing, nowhere else to be. She wrote about what the next version of the predictive architecture could be if built differently from the foundation. She wrote about Kaylin's whiteboard ideas and where they intersected with her own thinking and where they diverged and what those divergences might produce if you followed them out. She wrote about the gap between visible risk and actual risk and what it would mean to close that gap in markets and institutions where it had never been properly mapped. She wrote until the descent began, and she had to put the laptop away. The document was 9 pages. It still wasn't finished. It was a beginning. Check. Her mother was at the arrivals gate at Hartsfield-Jackson when she came through, which she'd expected, though they hadn't confirmed it. Her mother had been meeting her at that gate since the first time Nyla had flown home from Singapore at 27, and neither of them had ever needed to arrange it explicitly because it was simply one of the things her mother did. She was smaller than memory. She always was. The yellow cardigan, 15 years old, washed soft, the kind of garment that had become an extension of a person rather than a thing they wore, and a paper coffee cup from the terminal kiosk, and the patient, unhurried look of a woman who had been standing in this spot for a while and had no complaint about that. When she saw Nyla, she didn't move toward her immediately. She just looked, the full taking stock look that saw everything, that had always seen everything, that had seen through every managed face Nyla had ever brought home from wherever she'd been and found the real one underneath. Nyla went to her. She put her arms around her mother, and her mother put her hands on Nyla's back, and they stood in the arrivals hall with people moving around them and rolling luggage and announcements overhead, and none of that touched them. Her mother was wearing the yellow cardigan, and it smelled of laundry soap and something underneath that was just her mother. The specific, irreplaceable smell of the person who had sat at a kitchen table in Atlanta and told an 11-year-old girl whose father had just died that they were going to be all right, and had been right about that, and had been right about most things that mattered. "You lost weight," her mother said into her shoulder. "I'll put it back," Nyla said. "The sweet potato thing is in the oven." "I know. I've been thinking about it since Incheon." Her mother pulled back just enough to look at her face. The full look again, close range, nothing hidden from it. "Tell me," her mother said. "All of it," Nyla said. "I'll tell you all of it, just not in the airport." Her mother nodded once and picked up her coffee cup. "Come on then," she said. "Traffic on the 285 is going to be ugly." She stayed 10 days. She slept in her childhood bedroom under the window that faced the backyard maple, which was in full late October color. The particular red of a maple in Georgia autumn that she'd grown up taking for granted and had spent years in Seoul occasionally and unexpectedly missing. She slept badly and deeply in different proportions each night. The way you slept when your nervous system was finally being allowed to complete a process it had been deferring for months. She took her mother to the specialist on the 3rd day. They drove across the city in her mother's car, her mother navigating from the passenger seat with the calm confidence of a woman who had been going to this building for 3 years and had formed opinions about the most efficient route. The waiting room had the same chairs it always had, the same end table with the same magazines nobody ever touched. She sat beside her mother and they talked about nothing important. A neighbor's new dog, a local news story her mother had been following, the sweet potato dish and whether it needed more brown sugar than the recipe called for. And the nothing important conversation was its own kind of essential, the specific nourishment of two people who love each other talking about small things because the large things are already understood. The specialist used the word managed again, with the same specific medical optimism that meant livable, sustainable, not worsening. She'd been funding the treatment gap for 3 years through automatic transfers she'd set up from a separate account, never mentioned, never requiring acknowledgement. Her mother knew. She'd figured it out 18 months in, the way her mother always figured things out, but had never raised it directly, which was its own form of grace. They had a tacit agreement. The money was practical, and it was love, and it didn't need to be a conversation. Afterward, they ate lunch at a diner 2 blocks from the medical building, the kind of diner that still had laminated menus and refillable coffee and a piece of pie under a glass dome at the counter. Her mother ordered the soup. She ordered eggs. They ate slowly, without hurry, because there was nowhere else they needed to be. "He called you," her mother said. She looked up. "Min-jae," her mother said. "At some point. He called you." She set her fork down. "Yes, before the divorce finalized." "And?" "And he said something true," she said. "Something he'd understood too late." She picked up her coffee. "I told him I believed him. Because I did." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Was it enough? Her mother said. The truth? It was what it was. She held the coffee cup with both hands. It didn't change what I'd decided, but it changed the weight of carrying it. Her mother nodded slowly. You're not angry anymore. I was never very angry, she said. That's the thing people don't understand. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. When you finally see something exactly as it is, without the version of it you wanted it to be layered over the top, there's no anger in that. There's just the thing itself. Her mother looked at her for a long time across the diner table. Your father was like that, her mother said. He saw things clearly. It cost him sometimes because he couldn't pretend they were different than they were. She looked at her mother. They didn't talk about her father often, not because it was forbidden or too painful, but because they'd reached a point long ago where the memory of him was so fully integrated into who they both were that mentioning him felt less like invoking a ghost and more like acknowledging a foundation. I know, she said. I think about that. Her mother picked up her coffee. Come home more, her mother said. It wasn't a request or a complaint. It was a statement of what was true and what would be better if it changed. I will, she said, and meant it. On the 6th day, they drove out to Stone Mountain in the late afternoon. Not to climb it, just to sit in the park at the base of it and watch the light move across the granite face as the sun went west. Her mother brought a thermos of tea. She brought the blanket from the back seat of the rental car, and they sat on a bench with it across both their laps and watched the mountain go from gray to amber to the brief rose that lasted less than 5 minutes before the light went completely flat and the mountain became just a dark shape against the dimming sky. She thought about the Mapogu office. 3 rooms, 5 years, the filing cabinet against the wall, the single window looking onto the rooftop access of the adjacent building. She thought about what it had meant to go there every day, to build in the space between what Min-jae's world could see and what it couldn't, to work with the specific silent intensity of someone who knows that the work itself is the argument. She thought about the morning she'd left that office for the last time and not looked back at the building from the street. She thought about the Seoul Central District Court courtroom. The 4 seconds of silence after the judge's question removed the foundation from Choi's argument. The way the Hanul statement had sat on the judge's bench and done its work simply by being there, filed and real and voluntarily submitted by the man who'd had every reason to use it against her instead. She thought about what it meant that he hadn't. He filed the statement, she said. Her mother looked at her sideways. She'd been following Nyla's silences for 41 years and knew when one was heading somewhere. The man you married, her mother said. He submitted a document to a Korean court that removed his own legal position and cleared the way for my acquisition to close, she said. He didn't have to do it. His attorney probably argued against it. She looked at the mountain. He did it anyway. Why? Her mother said. She thought about that honestly. Because it was the right thing to do, she said. And because somewhere in the process of losing everything he thought he had, the position, the control, the version of our marriage he'd built in his head, somewhere in the middle of all that loss, he figured out what the right thing actually was. Her mother held the thermos. That's not nothing either, her mother said. No, she said, it's not. They sat on the bench until the dark came in fully and the mountain disappeared into it. And the only thing visible ahead of them was the sky beginning to show its first stars, faint and cold and very far away. And then they drove back to the house, and her mother heated the last of the sweet potato dish on the stove, and they ate at the kitchen table under the overhead light with the television low in the other room. And it was the ordinary, irreplaceable thing it always was, and she ate every bite on her plate and asked for more. She flew back to Seoul on a Tuesday. She sat in her seat and watched Atlanta fall away beneath the plain, the particular spread of it in the dark, highways threading through the suburbs, the airport's organized light, the city her mother moved through every day with the patient competence of a woman who had built a life from harder materials than most people started with and had never once required anyone to notice. She thought about the 9-page document on her laptop, about Kaylin's whiteboard, about the 2 former clients who had reached out through professional channels to say they'd be interested in whatever she built next. She thought about what it meant to build something next. Not for the money, which was already made and already secured and already doing what she'd designed it to do. Her mother's treatments, a foundation she'd established quietly to fund financial literacy programs for Black women in professional development, a reserve account she'd structured with the same conservative precision she brought to everything. For the thing itself, the work, the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of identifying a gap between what was visible and what was real and building something that closed it. She opened the laptop. She read the 9 pages. Then she opened a new page and wrote, Phase 1, Foundational Architecture. She wrote for the first hour of the flight, then stopped and looked out the window at the dark below the plane, which was the Atlantic beginning. She thought about Kaylin's idea, the one that diverged from her own thinking in the way that was most interesting, most worth following. She thought about what it would look like to follow it. She wrote for another hour. She stopped. She ate the meal the flight attendant brought. She looked at the darkness outside and thought about nothing in particular. Let her mind be empty in the way that minds needed to be sometimes, unfocused, unproductive, just resting in its own space. Then she wrote for another hour. When she finally closed the laptop and put it away and reclined her seat in the dark cabin with the low sounds of the plane around her, the engine's constant note, the air system, someone 2 rows back shifting in their sleep. She had 14 pages of the new foundation. It was the most she'd written in a single sitting since the earliest days of Siri. She closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes. 2 months after the acquisition closed, on a morning in early December when the first real winter cold had arrived in Seoul and the Han River had a gray metal quality in the low light that she'd always found, for reasons she'd never fully articulated, clarifying rather than bleak, she was driving the eastern Riverside route to a meeting in Yeouido. She'd left 40 minutes earlier than necessary because this was the route she took when she had 40 minutes to spare and wanted them to mean something. The river moved on her left, continuous, enormous, doing what rivers did, continuing. It didn't register the city it ran through. It didn't register the bridges. It had been here longer than everything visible from its banks and would be here after all of it. And there was something in that fact that she found, not comforting exactly, but useful. The reminder that the thing that endured was the thing that didn't negotiate with its own nature. Her phone rang. She looked at the display. Min-jae. She let it ring twice. Then she answered. Min-jae, she said. I saw the coverage, he said. The financial press. The profile in the international edition. A pause. You're everywhere. For now, she said. It's more than that, he said. You know it's more than that. She drove along the river. The cold morning light was doing something particular to the water's surface. A flat silver quality that wasn't beautiful exactly, but was deeply, honestly itself. I called because I wanted you to know, he said, that I understand now. What you built. What it took. He paused. Not just the company. What it took to build it where you built it. How it felt to work that hard while someone who should have been paying attention was looking somewhere else. She held the phone. Min-jae, she said. I know, he said. I know it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the decisions, she said. But understanding it, that matters. For you. For what you build from here. A long pause. You were always the strongest person in any room we were ever in together, he said. It came out quietly, with the particular weight of a statement that has been true for a long time and is being said out loud for the first time. I told myself different stories about that, for a long time. I know you did, she said. I think I knew it from Singapore, he said. I think that's what I was afraid of from the beginning. She thought about the dinner table in Singapore, the third drink she hadn't planned on finishing, the 2 good questions he'd asked about her methodology that had made her stay. She thought about the marble lobby of the Imperial Crown Hotel, the hand on another woman's back, the champagne glass she'd left full on the white linen. She thought about the kitchen table in Hanam-dong at midnight with barley tea going cold and a phone in her hand and 3 words sent to Priya, move to phase 4. I hope you become the man who can recognize strength sooner next time, she said, and let it be what it is instead of making it into something that has to be managed. He was quiet for a moment. I'm working on it, he said. I think I'm actually working on it. I believe you, she said. Take care of yourself, Nyla. You too, she said. The call ended. She drove along the river with the phone in the cup holder and both hands on the wheel. The meeting was in 22 minutes. She wasn't late. She had exactly the amount of time she'd planned to have, which was how she preferred things, which was how she'd always preferred things, which was something she'd stopped apologizing for a long time ago. The river moved on her left. The city moved around her. She cracked the window and let the December air come in, cold and clean, and carrying the particular smell of soul and winter, the river, and the concrete, and the exhaust. And underneath all of it, something that was just air, just the actual atmosphere of a place she had lived and worked and built things in, and would continue to build things in for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone else's permission. She thought about the filing cabinet in the Yongsan-gu office, the stiff top drawer, the scratch on the lower left corner, the 9-page document that was now 31 pages and growing. She thought about Kaylin's whiteboard and what it was going to become. She thought about her mother in the yellow cardigan, standing at an arrivals gate with a paper coffee cup, knowing from 20 feet away that her daughter had done something large and waiting patiently for her to come close enough to say so. She drove forward. The river stayed with her for another 3 kilometers, and then the road curved inland and it was gone. And the city was around her in all directions, moving and loud and making its constant demands. And she was in the middle of it, with her hands on the wheel and her eyes on the road ahead, carrying forward everything she'd chosen to keep and nothing she hadn't, on her way to a meeting that was the first step of whatever came next. She was not early. She was not late. She arrived exactly when she had decided to arrive.